Taoiseach, you have the floor for the first answers.
Thank you very much. I've written down a few notes. I mightn't be able to answer everyone, but I'll do my best to touch on as many topics as I can. And first of all, just want to particularly thank almost all the speakers here today for their ongoing support and solidarity with Ireland. That's very much recognised, and we're very grateful for that. I think Mrs. Zimmer spoke about the need to reduce inequality among member states, and I think that's something that I can very much sign up to as well. It's a long time since enlargement, and there is still a huge gap in prosperity between Western Europe on the one hand and the countries of Central and Eastern Europe on the other. And I think that's why it's so important that the next MFF, the next European budget, contains in it adequate funding to continue to improve the infrastructure in Central and Eastern Europe and also to support the common agricultural policy. And I think it's why it's so important as well, as I mentioned in my speech earlier, that we put forward a realistic pathway to European membership for the Western Balkans. I think the best way we can stabilise that part of Europe is to give them a pathway towards joining the European Union, those countries that used to be part of Yugoslavia and Albania as well. I think on tax, which I know is an issue of contention between many people in this chamber and Ireland, the view that we take as a government, and I think it's shared by a lot of governments in fact, is that national taxes should fund national budgets, and that is therefore a national competence and a matter of national sovereignty. We do have European taxes at the moment that fund European budget, or at least in part fund the European budget. We have that with customs, we have that with an element of VAT, and that's something that I'm not opposed to at all. And if you look at the model that exists in the United States, which is a federation after all, there is a lot of tax competition between member states. There are federal income taxes and there are state income taxes. There are different sales taxes in different member states. So if the United States, the most successful economy in the world, can have tax competition among member states, why can't we have the same? And as I said, we have a number of federal taxes already, or European taxes already, that fund the EU budget, and that's something that I think works quite well. In terms of the Apple case, I think it's important not to forget that it is a state aid case. Technically, it's not a tax case, it's a state aid case. And the contention is that Ireland had a special deal with one particular company. And quite frankly, we didn't. And that is why that case is being appealed both by Apple and by the Irish government. And ultimately, the European courts and the European Court of Justice will make a judgment on that. And whatever that judgment is, our government will accept. We're establishing an escrow account. We will collect the money in Q2 of this year, or at least start collecting it in Q2 of this year, and the money will be held in the escrow account until that decision is made by the European Court of Justice. But it is our contention and it is our belief that we did not have a special arrangement with that company, and we can't say that we did when we know that we didn't, but ultimately that's going to be a matter for those courts to decide. But what I do want to say is that Ireland is not a tax haven. We don't want to be a tax haven, and we certainly don't want to be seen or perceived as a tax haven. And we have no interest, in fact, in a race to the bottom. Our low corporation tax rate, 12.5%, it's been around for 20 or 30 years now. We haven't increased it, we haven't reduced it, we've just kept it exactly as it is now. And Ireland won't win a race to the bottom. It's already the case that a number of countries have a lower tax rate for corporations than we do. Hungary and Bulgaria, just to give two examples. So if this is a race to the bottom, it's not one that Ireland is going to win. And then, as was mentioned by other speakers, countries like France, just to use one example, have a high corporation profit tax on paper, but have so many exemptions and so many different ways not to pay your tax that according to the OECD, their effective tax rate is actually lower than ours. So if it's a race to the bottom, it's not one that Ireland is going to win, and therefore not one that we want to participate on. The future of our economy and the future of our prosperity is going to be much more about human capital and attracting talent and people than attracting companies based on corporate tax rate. And we've already made a number of big changes to our tax policy. We've abolished the double Irish, got rid of stateless corporations. We've started taxing intellectual property again just this year. And we'll continue to make steps in those directions and close loopholes. But we want other countries to do that as well, quite frankly. And there's a bit of hypocrisy about that when you look at the amount of money that we actually collect in terms of corporate taxes versus other countries who collect so much less, but yet on paper have a higher tax rate. And I think that needs to be challenged. And it's also very much my strong contention that the progress that we make on this should be done on an international level through the OECD process. And I say that for a very obvious reason, that Europeans shouldn't do something unilaterally that only causes other countries that are not part of the European Union to gain an advantage over us, whether it's the United States, whether it's Japan, or whether it's the United Kingdom, which of course is going to leave. And we need to bear that in mind in anything that we do. On climate change, Ireland is somewhat unusual to other countries in that a huge amount of our greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. And that's because we've never really had heavy industry. We never had those big heavy industries that other countries have decommissioned and shut down and achieved their targets in that way. That's not something we can do. But as far as I'm concerned, we are a laggard. I'm not proud of Ireland's performance on climate change. We need to do a lot more. And one of the things my government will do in the next few months is publish our 10-year investment plan, our capital investment plan for Ireland over the next 10 years. And central to that will be the kind of things that we want to do around climate change to make sure we meet those targets in 2030. And that includes things in transport like electrifying our railways. We only have one small part of our railway that's electrified. It's about transitioning our public transport and our bus fleet to low emissions. It's about electric cars in particular, where we put in some incentives, but they haven't got the results that we've liked. And there's lots of things that we intend to do so that we can meet those targets. And it's something that I'm very committed to, and certainly my generation of politicians is very committed to. It makes sense. It's not just the right thing to do, it makes sense economically, I think, in the longer term as well. In terms of the contribution of Mrs Dodds, which I very much welcome. Certainly, I have no wish to see any borders between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And I also have no wish to see any new borders or barriers between Britain and Ireland, or between Northern Ireland and Britain. That's why I didn't want Brexit, because I don't want any borders. And certainly we'll do everything we can to avoid any of that taking place. And I know what you said, and I understand what you said, that the union that is most important for you is the United Kingdom, and the single market that is most important to you is the single market of the United Kingdom. And 70% of trade between Northern Ireland is with the rest of the United Kingdom. I acknowledge that. But it shouldn't be a choice between the 70% and the 30%. Why not take the 100%? And it is possible to have special arrangements for Northern Ireland, if needs be, that allows Northern Ireland to have that because of its unique situation. And I think that's something that I will work for, and something that I hope that politicians from all sides of Northern Ireland will be open to. If 100% is possible, take that, not 70 instead of 30. And I hope it's possible to for us to have that discussion a little bit more in the future. Just in relation to Mr Farage's contribution, I just as a matter of information, I've never worked here, by the way. I've worked in Ireland and the United States. I've never worked in Europe or for a European institution. But in relation to small countries, I really have to disagree, because I experienced that in a very, very personal way, not just in relation to the support that we've received on Brexit from the European institutions, but also when, for the first time, I attended a European Council meeting, the meeting of the Prime Ministers and Presidents of Europe. And it's a really interesting and humbling experience to get to do that. And I know some of you who've been Prime Ministers will have had that experience, because Council of Ministers is very different. You go into this massive room, you sit there, the ambassador sits beside you, you have 6 officials behind you, and it's a very different experience when you go into the Council of Ministers. And I went into the Council of Ministers for the first time last year. I sat around the table, there were no officials there, the only people there were the President of the Council, the President of the Commission, and the heads of government of 26, 27 or 28 member states. And I come from a country that is only 4.5 million people. We're a small country. There are many provinces, even cities in other European countries that have more people than mine and have a bigger economy of mine. And I was sitting around the table as an equal with the President of France, the Chancellor of Germany, the Prime Minister of Spain, the Prime Minister of Italy, these really big countries. And that isn't the way Europe used to work. Before the European Union, the big countries would get together, they decide what is right for Europe, and they tell the rest of us. That doesn't happen anymore because of the European Council. And because of these, these European institutions. And I'm not so naive as to think that a country like Ireland, with 4.5 million people, can ever have the power or importance of a country like Germany with 80 million and its massive economy. But what the European Union allows us to do is it allows small countries to have a seat at the table when decisions are made, as opposed to having no say at all. And that's why I believe small countries are so much better off to be in this union. But finally, just in relation to Britain, and I want to say that Britain is a country that I care a lot about. Irish people are very close to British people in so many ways, even though sometimes we don't like to admit that. In so many ways, we have a shared culture and a shared history. And that's very much the experience of my family as well. My parents met and fell in love and got married in England. She's an Irish nurse, he's a doctor from India. They both went to Britain to build a new life, and that's where they met, that's where they married, that's where they fell in love. That's where my sister was born, and she still lives there in London with my niece and nephew, who are English kids. They point up at the Union Jack and they say, "Leo, that's our flag." And that's how close Irish people, in many ways, are to British people. We're connected by blood in so many different ways. And that's why I really regret the decision that has been made on Brexit, because so much will be lost. Young people will lose the right to live, work and study anywhere in the European Union, losing those rights as European citizens. My niece and nephew won't, because they're entitled to Irish passports, but the other kids in their class will, and I think that's a real shame. British businesses could lose their access. British businesses could lose their access to the biggest market in the world. Farmers, food producers, even the beer makers that you and I are so fond of, could lose the subsidies that they currently benefit from, which are not guaranteed beyond this Parliament. And also, I'm conscious as well of British veterans, very brave people who fought on the beaches of France, not just for Britain, but also for European democracy and for European values. And people like that are always in my mind. So notwithstanding the decision to leave, and I respect that decision, I will absolutely fight hard to ensure that we can have as close as possible partnership and as close a possible relationship between the UK and the EU. It's in Ireland's interests. I think it's in the interests of British people, and it's in the interests of the European Union as well. I think we should conclude a new partnership and a new agreement with the UK. But fundamentally, what we have to move away from is any idea that any country can have a relationship that involves taking all the benefits and none of the responsibilities and obligations. And that's the fundamental thing that we need to insist on.
Passiamo ora al caso